So we've talked about how to understand a system, how to use that understanding to make some measurements to analyze the performance of the system while it's operating. Now let's get to the juicy part, making some changes to this thing to make it perform better. So to have a successful business, you have to create systems. And the tricky part is once you create them, you have to improve them continuously. You have to keep making them better and better and better over time. And changing the systems once they're in place can be surprisingly tricky because of the second and third and fourth order effects that we talked about earlier. So we're going to talk about improving systems now.
Improving systems. Question for reflection. Are you actively working to improve the systems your business relies upon?
The first idea in improving systems is called optimization. And optimization is the process of maximizing the output or minimizing the input of a system. So maximization focuses on a system's throughput. So it's changing the system so whatever the system is designed to produce is produced faster and cheaper and more efficiently. Okay, you're trying to get the system to output as much as it possibly can. Minimization focuses on the system's inputs. So for example, you can improve a manufacturing system by changing the system to require less raw materials to produce the same result. That's an example of minimization. And there's a little bit of a tricky part here, which is you can't optimize multiple variables in a system at once. A lot of people use the word optimized as a general term that means make better. And when you start doing that, when you start trying to control for more than one thing at a time, you are no longer optimizing, you are making trade-offs. And that's a very different thing. So focus your efforts on the most important improvement that you need to make first. And then if you run into a situation where maximizing one thing means you're reaching an unacceptable level in something else, then you can start the trade-off process. But by definition, optimization is either maximizing one thing or minimizing another, and you have to choose one.
Optimization. Questions for reflection. What single output are you trying to maximize or minimize? How can you increase the output of the system without compromising the system's flexibility and resilience?
Now, refactoring is an idea that comes from software development. And refactoring is the process of changing a system to improve its efficiency without changing the output of a system. So, Evan, you program all the time. How many times have you rewritten a program that when you're done, it does the exact same thing? Plenty. Why do you do it? If it does the same thing, why do you spend your time and energy doing that instead of something else?
There are a lot of different reasons for doing it. Sometimes it's if you've got something that's not performing up to the speed that it needs to, you need to rewrite it to increase the speed. You rewrite it to make the code more maintainable. It's like the first time it was written in a way where if a developer came along a year down the line to look back at it, they wouldn't be able to understand it, so rewriting it for maintainability. There are lots of other
more
reasons.
efficient too, like like the memory utilization or something like that.
Yeah, there are a lot of justifications for rewriting something that basically produces the same output.
Yeah.
But does it better.
But does it better. And that's the purpose of refactoring. You're looking for the same result. You're just changing the process to make it require less resources or to make it faster or to make it easier to change the system in a sane way over time. And that type of system improvement is just as important, if not more important sometimes, than changing the system to get more output or to require less input. So a lot of times when you're improving a system, it'll tend to go in cycles. Sometimes you'll focus on optimizing the output, pushing for more throughput, doing things to make the system do more. And sometimes you'll take a step back and say, okay, the systems that we're using right now are getting a little crazy. They're getting a little hard to maintain. And you go through a consolidation period of refactoring your internal systems so they are less complex, they require less effort, they're more maintainable. And that puts you in a position where you can focus on growing the system again. So there's kind of a back and forth relationship that happens. You need to be able to do both. And which is most important to do will change based on how your business system grows and changes over time.
Refactoring. Questions for reflection. Could the systems you're improving benefit from refactoring? Once you've deconstructed the system, what could you remove or reconfigure to make the system more efficient?
Now, very important idea in the optimization of a system is called the critical few. There are many words or many names for this general approach. Some people call it the 80-20 rule, or Pareto's law, or any of the number of things that this has been called over the course of centuries. The critical few says a minority of the inputs in a system produce the majority of the outputs or the results of a system, or take up 20% of the resources but are 80% of the utilization. There are all sorts of different ways to say it. And you can think of this just for yourself. Imagine your closet or your dresser, and of all the clothes you own, chances are very, very good that you wear just a few things that you own most of the time. And there are lots of things that you have in your dresser or closet that don't get used but are still there, right? Think of the contact list you have in your cell phone. You probably call just a couple of people over and over and over again, and most of the people you have in your contact list you never call. So you see this over and over and over and over again. It applies to pretty much everything, which is kind of odd because there are all sorts of things that it applies to. From a business perspective, this applies to things like customers, particularly customer profitability. If you really look at the profit that's coming in from your customer list, chances are there's a very small group of people who are providing most of the profit, and 80% of the customers that you are serving, give or take, are not producing as much as that very small core group. So when you notice this pattern at work, and a lot of times all it takes is just looking to see if it exists. More often than not, it probably does. That's really good news. Because if that's true, you can make more money or get more of the results that you want by focusing on that critical few, the 20% that are giving you most of the results, and spending far less time and energy on the customers that you may be spending a lot of time and energy on that really aren't giving you as much results as other customers. So you can achieve really great results by focusing on the critical inputs. You can do the same thing for the results you don't want. So think of all of your frustrations in life or in your business. There's probably a small number of things that are really, really ticking you off. And most of the things in your life are probably pretty okay. So if you eliminate that 20% of things that are sucking your time or sucking your soul or sucking your energy, get those out of your life very quickly, and all of a sudden you have more time and energy to do the things that are leading to more of what you want. This is very useful both on a business analysis standpoint, what customers do you focus on, as well as a life satisfaction standpoint. What gives you the most of the experience you want to have? So that top 20%, those are your ideal customers, the customers that you are serving most effectively. The question for the lower part of your list is, are there things that you can do to turn the people on that list into an ideal customer? If you can, great, keep them. That's where you start to get into things like qualification of what is it about this particular customer that's causing a lot of work but not a whole lot of reward. So it has to do with where are your results coming from? Who are your ideal customers? Who are your customers that are sucking up all of your time and attention? Is there a correlation there? If there's not, if you have a low margin customer who is sucking up all your time, you can encourage them to do business with another company. In the same way that if there are characteristics of an ideal customer that some of your lower margin customers have, you can do things to encourage those customers to become more and more and more like your ideal customer.
The critical few. Questions for reflection. What are the small number of inputs that are creating most of your desired results? How can you spend more time and energy doing the things that are making the biggest difference? What inputs are causing most of your frustrations and problems, and how can you reduce or eliminate them?
Now, there's also an idea called diminishing returns. And diminishing returns means after a certain point, having more of something can become detrimental. Classic example of this from my advertising days is when a new commercial would be filmed for television, we would air it and we would spend to show that commercial more and more and more and more and more. At a certain point, we could see where spending $1 on advertising was maybe only giving us back $1.10 in terms of return. Whereas there was another commercial for another brand that we could spend $1 and get $3 or $4 out of it. So diminishing returns, yes, we could continue to spend profitable money on showing that advertisement. But the value of continuing to do that reaches a certain threshold and then it drops off very quickly. And so optimizing everything for perfection is pretty much impossible. There's going to be a point where additional effort is not going to produce enough of the result that you want. And so that's the point to stop doing that thing and start doing something else. So the rule of thumb is optimize until you reach the point of diminishing returns, then focus on something else. So that decision depends on your opportunity cost. So if you stop spending time and energy and money doing this thing, what are you going to then focus on, and is that better or worse than what you're focusing on right now?
Diminishing returns. Questions for reflection. Can you identify the point of diminishing returns? Where are you investing time, resources, or energy in a way that's inefficient or ineffective?
Now, friction is any process that removes energy from a system over time. This is an idea that comes from physics. So one of my favorite thought experiments. Take a hockey puck, drop it in the middle of a field of tall grass, and you have a hockey stick. Your goal is to get the hockey puck from where you are right now to a goal that is positioned 1 mile away from where you are right now. What is that experience going to be like? Miserable. Why? Yeah, so you take the stick, you whack the puck, and what happens? Maybe you whack the puck, right? You lose the puck. If you hit the puck, what happens?
2 feet.
Yeah, it goes 2 feet. Because the tall grass is robbing the energy from the puck, and it just drops a couple feet away. And it's going to take a long, long time for you to reach that goal. Now let's take a big lawnmower. Let's mow the grass down. So it's a couple inches high. And you have the same puck, the same hockey stick, and the same goal. How much effort are you going to need to expend to accomplish the result?
Less.
Yeah, less. It's still not going to be negligible. Yes. Now, let's take the grass, let's mow it down to nothing, let's flood the field with water and freeze it. Now we're cooking. Why? Less friction. You hit the puck once and the puck travels further, because when the stick transfers energy to the puck keeps more of that energy. The ice takes less of it than the grass did, so the puck travels longer. You're only going to have to hit the puck a couple of times before you get to the end result. That's friction. So friction is present in every single system that exists. So you can add energy to the system, but any friction that's present is going to slow the system down. And to keep the system operating at the same rate, you're going to have to continue to add energy to it. The more friction that's present in the system, the more energy you have to keep adding in order to keep the system moving. So one of the ways that you can improve a system is to reduce the amount of friction it takes to do things. The less friction means the less energy you need to expend. The less energy you need to expend, the more energy you have to do other things. So even doing something as simple and seemingly stupid as, if you have a lot of papers that you need to staple together, put your stapler by where you work instead of having to walk across your office to get it 5 times a day. Because that simple friction thing repeated over and over and over and over again becomes really annoying. That adds up. Same thing happens in designing any sort of system, really. So an automation line, the less energy it takes to get an item from one step to another in the process, the more efficient that process is going to be overall. So as a general rule, by removing unnecessary friction from the system, the entire system will operate more effectively. Now, there are some things or some systems in which it's beneficial to introduce some friction intentionally.
Brakes.
Yes, brakes operate on friction. Friction is how a braking system works. But there are even some things like, if you don't want a person or a system to do something, make it a little harder for that thing to happen. If it takes money and effort and time, fewer people will choose to ultimately do that. So there are some parts of your system where it makes sense to introduce or increase just a little bit the amount of friction it takes to take an action. So you can use it both positively and negatively. If you remove friction from the system, it'll be more efficient. If you want something to not happen, increasing the amount of friction it takes to happen is the best way to do it.
Friction. Questions for reflection. Where can you identify wasted time, resources, and energy? How can you eliminate this unnecessary friction? Do you have regularly scheduled time to review your business's current systems and processes in an attempt to identify and eliminate friction?
Now, let's talk about a subject super fascinating. It's automation. And automation refers to a system or a process that can operate without human intervention. So whenever a person needs to expend energy in order for the system to move forward, in our conversation of scale, things that can be duplicated or things that multiply, people don't scale. They can't duplicate endlessly. But a machine, properly constructed and properly maintained, can. Doesn't require sleep, doesn't require a lunch break, just produces things over and over and over again. That can be a really good thing if you need the system to produce. So automation works for repetitive, well-defined tasks. So if you design an item, and the purpose of the system is to, in an automated way, duplicate that item over and over and over again, there's the potential to automate that system. And the less human intervention, the more efficient the automation. If the system can run by itself and nobody needs to touch it, that'll probably be pretty efficient. If human operators need to do things along the way, that represents a friction cost in the automation.
Automation. Questions for reflection. Could the process or system you're improving potentially be automated? How could you remove human effort or intervention from the process?
So automation, when you're talking about super scalable businesses, you're usually involving some element of automation, which is very useful, but has a couple of drawbacks. And the first is what's called the paradox of automation. And the paradox of automation says that the more efficient the automated system is, the more crucial the human contribution of the operators is to that system. So humans are less involved because it's efficient, but when they have to get involved, it's really, really critical that they get involved in the right time. And here's why. If an automated system has an error, an automated system will multiply that error until it is fixed or the system is shut down. So, thought example for this. Think of a fully automated machine that is responsible for making microprocessors, so the chips that go in a computer or a cell phone. Part of that machine requires an element that drills a little hole in a silicon wafer. And let's say hypothetically that that drill gets misaligned just a little bit, and it starts drilling holes through the middle of the processor core, ruining every chip that goes through it. Now, the reason the machine exists in the first place is because it can produce these chips, or duplicate these chips very quickly, faster than a human could. But when this little misalignment occurs, that error is duplicated across every unit that machine turns out. So for every second that machine keeps running, the company is losing money because they're spending raw materials on something they can't sell that are ruined. So the more efficient that machine is, the more chips it can turn out a minute, the more crucial it is for the human operators to see what's going down and shutting it down quickly. Because if they wait too long, that can get really expensive really fast. So the paradox of automation is efficient automated systems make human beings more important, not less important, because their involvement in the system when it is required becomes really, really critical.
The paradox of automation. Questions for reflection. For any automated systems you use, do you have qualified human operators ready to jump in and fix errors quickly? How can you identify systematic errors before they create significant damage?
Now there's an irony, which goes back to our conversation of human psychology. And the irony of automation is that the more reliable the automated system, the less human operators have to do. The less human operators have to do, the less attention they pay to the system while it's in operation. Because we love novelty. And if there is one thing that efficient automated systems are not, they are not novel. They do the same thing over and over and over again. And that's a situation that human beings just aren't good at paying attention to over a long period of time. So the efficient and reliable systems tend to make it really difficult for operators to know there's an error, even though it's really, really, really important for the operators to notice the error when the system is particularly efficient. So if an error isn't noticed, at least in the human mind, it can kind of become the new normal. That's just how the system works. And if the error is not caught, the error is duplicated and potentially multiplied across every single unit that type of system turns out. Which leads us into the Toyota example. Recently, there was a concern about Toyota's braking systems and the potential of an error in those braking systems that was causing a catastrophic failure of control in Toyota automobiles. Now, after a long period of research and testing, the official result was there was no problem. It was a perception thing, it was a concern thing. But it was also a major threat lockdown thing for people buying Toyotas because nobody wants to buy a car that could potentially kill them. So it was still a huge issue for the company. And there was a major concern about the safety of all of these vehicles because the braking system that was at issue was present in most of the cars that Toyota produced over a period of approximately 10 years. It's a lot of calls. The recall was, what, $2 billion? And it was because the potential of an error in a system that was duplicated over and over and over and over again. And as a result, that final number became a really super big expense. So the best way to avoid this, if you're dealing with automation, this is a risk, right? There is the risk that an error is going to be multiplied, and if that error is bad enough, it's going to be very costly. So the best way to avoid the error is rigorous sampling and testing. So quality assurance gives you the best shot of finding an error when it is made, and also, given the irony of automation, it gives your operators something to do in the meantime to pay attention to the system as it's operating. And that helps sustain the attention, and that makes it far more likely that you're going to catch any errors that are made.
The irony of automation. Questions for reflection. How can you keep the operators of your automated system engaged enough to notice when things go wrong? What means of testing do you have at your disposal to quickly identify errors in automation?
one of my favorite ideas of all time. Standard operating procedure, abbreviated SOP. So a standard operating procedure is a predefined process used to complete a task or resolve an issue. So the general guiding principle behind standard operating procedures is don't reinvent the wheel. There's no need to. In the operation of a business, remember, a business is a system. It is a repeatable process designed to produce a particular result. There are probably some things that you're going to need to do on a regular basis over and over and over and over again. And instead of trying to figure out what to do every time you have to do it, you notice the things that you're doing most often, decide on a process once, and then the next time you have to do it, you don't have to think about it. You just pull out the operating procedure and follow it from A to Z. And the wonderful thing about standard operating procedures is they really reduce the amount of friction it takes for a human person who is following the procedure to get started and work their way through the process, because there's almost no willpower involved. They don't have to psych themselves up to figure out this new problem and figure out what they need to do about it. The problem is already solved. They just need to refer to the operating procedure, do it, get it done, and it requires a whole lot less energy than it otherwise would be. Also, standard operating procedures are a wonderful training tool. So the more systematized and process-oriented your business is, the easier it is to bring in someone who is smart and who is motivated but has no experience in your business and teach them how to do what needs to be done. And once you have the operating procedures, it's important to make sure that they don't calcify. So as your business changes, your process changes, your standard operating procedures have to change in order to remain relevant and in order to remain optimal. So Dan, you're like the king of standard operating procedures now.
I love them. I mean, anything that I do more than once, I start thinking about like, oh, I'm gonna have to do this again. So I'll spend the extra maybe 20% of time to make it a system, so then I don't have to do it again, which is great. I'm still part of the process, but it's pieces that I can quickly delegate, because I can say, you work on step 2, I'm gonna get started on step 3, because they're not dependent. Or what does client interaction look like? I mean, from as basic, as silly as someone filled out something on the website. Okay, so who gets that email? And then what do? Do we call them? Do we email them? What's going on there? What if they're interested? Then do we set up a follow-up call? Okay, then we talk about pricing. Did pricing get talked about? And from pricing, are we into a proposal, check back time? After the check back, is it going to committee for them? Are they just knocking it down? Because it makes life so much easier. And then there isn't so much thinking. You're just getting cracking on your biz, and it's really productive time.
And I remember the discussion we had when it finally clicked, because you were very resistant to this process
Yes.
when we started. It's like, you want me to do what?
It's like, I don't have time for that.
That's not fun. Right.
That sounds boring.
And I remember, because it was about this time last year, where it finally clicked that doing these things was more fun and helped you be more creative and do better work, instead of looking like a whole lot of bureaucracy and paperwork that you don't have time to do and you don't want to do anyway.
It was a total multiplier of my time, total duplicator, because as soon as I could do it, I could just hand stuff off, and all of a sudden there were 2 of me, or 3 of me. I can hand an SOP to an intern and get KPIs done. Crazy! I mean, never mind you talk about billable hours and stuff. I mean, if you've got everything SOP'd and then you're just handing that out to literally interns and you're billing for it as full-time rate, I mean, not that I would do that, but others may. But it's great.
But starting with an SOP is the first step in really thinking about what you do as a process, a series of steps that's designed to produce a result. And sometimes what you're doing is high touch, like Dan. It requires human beings to take a look and go through each step in the process. Sometimes you start looking at a standard operating procedure and you have a series of steps and you realize that, hey, if I made an automated system, I wouldn't have to do any of this stuff. But you never get to that point until you sit down and put the steps down on paper, which is what a standard operating procedure is designed to do. What do you do? Describe what you do. A, B, C, D, E, F, G. So the first step is just learning to think along these terms and treat what you're doing as a process first. And the rule of thumb is the more creative what you're doing is, chances are the more you need these And the more having these types of things will actually free you to do the creative parts of your work.
Standard operating procedure. Questions for reflection. Do you have clearly defined standard operating procedures for common situations, errors, or problems? How can you ensure that your team will be able to access and update operating procedures quickly and easily?
Now, a particular type of standard operating procedure or a format of a standard operating procedure is a checklist. And a checklist is an externalized, predefined standard operating procedure for completing a specific task. And an example of this, where checklists are used systematically, are in pilot training and in the actual flight, the operation of aircraft.
Lawyers, too.
Lawyers, doctors. There are all sorts of areas in which checklists are used because there are a set of things that need to happen. If they don't happen, or if something is overlooked, that could be a very bad thing. So if a pilot doesn't check to see whether a particular system is working, or whether there's ice on the wings, or any one of the 20 or 30 big critical things that could be easily overlooked, instead of trying to keep that all in their working memory as they're going through this very complicated process, having a checklist makes it really easy. You just go down the list, make sure everything is as it is supposed to be, and then you can move on with your life. And memorization, it's helpful, but a lot of the things that we create checklists for are larger than our working memory is designed to handle.
Like 5 to 7 things.
5 to 7 things, including the things that you're currently trying to think about at the time. So keeping in mind a list of things that need to be done while you're trying to focus on something else, while you're in a very busy environment with lots of other priorities going on, is just a recipe to forget something. There's a wonderful book full of fascinating stories called The Checklist Manifesto by Atul Gawande. He is the medical writer for The New Yorker. And one of the key stories that he tells is there was a doctor that decided to do a research study. And there's a very short procedure, which is inserting an IV line into a patient. Happens all the time, tons of times a day. And it's one of those things that doctors and nurses are trained very early on. They practice this all the time. It's a standard procedure, 5 steps. And the 5 steps are really brain-dead simple things like wash the area around the insertion site with an antiseptic, put drapes over the patient, put on sterile gloves. I mean, these are not rocket science things on this checklist. And what this doctor wanted to do is go to a hospital that had the highest rate of IV line infections over 10 days and just test to see if using a checklist would improve it. And the first thing that happened was they proposed this, and all of the doctors just got really ticked off. It's like, how dare you? I went to medical school for 10 years. I do this every day. I am a highly trained professional. It's insulting to suggest that I use a checklist. Even more insulting was the study revolved around giving the checklist to the head nurse and giving the head nurse the power to interrupt the doctor and say, you missed something on the checklist, you have to stop until you do this. Which, in the medical profession, is just like way, like authority role reversal that was very, very controversial. But they did it anyway. In this particular hospital, I believe, which was in Detroit, there was something like a 12% rate of IV line infections after 10 days. After implementing a 5-step checklist, that number went to 0. And it was simple, it was straightforward, but the truth is, even a very simple 5-step checklist, when you have a patient in the ICU who is crashing, and you have 50 things that you're trying to figure out and do, and everybody's running around, and you're trying to focus on your job, it's really, really easy to simply forget or not notice that you haven't prepped the insertion site with chlorhexidine antiseptic. It's really, really easy to do that. So implementing a checklist, even a simple one, led to, I think they calculated, they saved 3 or 4 people's lives and a couple $1 million in costs by implementing a checklist. So it's one of those things. It's easy. It doesn't feel like much. It doesn't look like much. And it's kind of a way of outsourcing your brain, right? You're putting it out on paper, You just check it. You don't have to think as much. You just verify or walk through the steps, and then it's done. And it's done right every time. So that's the value of a checklist.
Checklist. Questions for reflection. Could any of your standard operating procedures be converted into a simple checklist? How can you ensure you rely on the checklist instead of winging it?
Now, cessation refers to the conscious choice to stop doing something that's counterproductive. So a lot of times when we think about improving systems, we think about doing something, adding something to the system, working more, when a lot of times it's more effective to stop doing something that is not beneficial or is actively harming the result that you want. And the reason for this is because we all suffer from absence blindness. We tend to value doing things that you can see and undervalue stopping doing things because it doesn't look like we're doing much of anything, which is true. That's the whole point, right? So doing nothing may be the best path in many cases, but we don't tend to see those things unless we remind ourselves to look for them. So this was popularized, I think this was a Tom Peters thing. Just like you have a to-do list, start creating a not-to-do list, things that you should stop doing or stop focusing your attention on. And if someone is doing something that they've always done, and part of the perceived value of their job is that they do this thing, and them not doing that becomes a threat to their value to the organization, that's where people start to kind of go into threat lockdown. So one of the ways to kind of route around that is to help people understand that you're trying to make sure that their valuable time and attention and expertise are being invested in the things that are going to make the biggest difference. And you want to free up all of their time and energy from all of the stuff that's not working and allow them to invest in the things that are. So ceasing to do something that somebody is used to doing and identifies themselves with doing is difficult. You just need to kind of redirect that onto something that's perceived as more important. So that's cessation. A lot of times the biggest improvements you can make in a system or a process is stopping and starting to do something else. Stop, start, continue is an example of a technique that uses cessation.
Cessation. Questions for reflection. Are you actually causing some of the problems you're experiencing by trying to do too much? What could you stop doing to make things better?
Now, resilience means having the toughness and flexibility to handle change and uncertainty. So to respond or react to the things that life throws at you. And resilience is a very underrated quality in business because business culture as it exists right now tends to really focus on performance, right? Who's making the most money? Who has the biggest market share? Who has X? Who has Y? And there is a tendency to make decisions that reward that performance or lead to that performance in the short term, even if they make the business potentially catastrophically unstable when something bad happens. So for example, if you want to increase your short-term profit, cancel your insurance, all of it, cancel all of your backup systems, cancel your emergency management systems, cancel everything that's not related to $1 in profit coming out at the end of the day. There are so many firms that are doing the equivalent of that by not thinking of things, investments they need to make their business more flexible and resilient in case something does happen. And the thing is, resilience doesn't come with optimal throughput. That flexibility comes at a price. When you pay insurance, you're using money that you could spend on something that directly generates revenue. If you invest in a backup system, you're spending money that could be used in doing something that generates revenue. So from a pure dollars in profit on a short-term basis, it's not optimal. But investing in those backup systems and investing in that insurance gives you the flexibility and resilience to handle it when something unexpected occurs. That's the value of it. The trick is you need to invest in those things before you need them.
Resilience. Questions for reflection. How resilient is your business? How resilient is your personal life? What could you do to increase your flexibility and toughness in the face of the unexpected?
Which leads to a related concept called a fail-safe. So a fail-safe is a backup system designed to prevent or allow recovery from a primary system failure. So have you ever had the experience of using a computer and your hard drive dies? Worst feeling in the world, right? All of your hard work, poof, gone. Now, they're not efficient. As we talked about, installing a backup system for your hard drive requires some money, requires some time, requires some effort. And sometimes it's not cheap. Particularly if you're trying to make sure large volumes of data are backed up, it becomes really not cheap. But here's the trick. You can't suffer a hard drive failure and say, hey, I would love to install a backup system now. It doesn't work that way. You have to install the fail-safe before the fail-safe is needed, because when you need it, it already has to be in place in order for it to work. It also needs to be tested. If you have a fail-safe or a backup that you never test, you don't know if and when you suffer a primary system failure, if it's actually going to bring that information back. That's why you never install a fail-safe without testing it. And there are some risks, like if you have a primary system failure on something that's not super important, you may choose not to install a fail-safe. Because if something goes wrong, you could just deal with it. It's not going to be that big of a deal. But for things that are critical to the continued operation of yourself or your business, fail-safes can become super, super, super important. And you want to make sure they're in place, even though it requires an upfront investment to have that flexibility and resilience. So a large part of fail-safes is what would constitute a catastrophic failure of a primary system for you. And if you can't self-insure that risk, you need to look at a backup system to make sure that it's okay. Now, another critical point is you need to separate your fail-safe from the primary system as much as possible. Because if those two systems are highly interdependent or tightly coupled, a failure in your backup system could cascade to the primary system and take both down at the same time.
Just happened to us.
Really? What was the story?
So we have a level 4 or level 7 government data center, security data center. The backup servers were in the exact same room and the roof leaked. And it was underground. So it became a pool and our whole entire website went down.
Yep.
For indefinite. I mean, it was level red, tech guys running all over the place, screaming in the building, like, and pagers and Blackberries were going off. And so it was funny because there's another guy in the marketing team who worked in banks, and he said, that is not redundancy by definition.
Yeah, that's not a fail-safe.
Yeah, like how could that have happened? And it was just one little thing.
Yeah.
I hope that they have solved for that. But a big storm came through, roof leak, rain. We're an insurance company. That's kind of ironic.
Yeah.
And it flooded the basement. It flooded the basement and took the system down. And
Yeah.
you're talking about, that's a lot of money. That's
Yes, it
sending
is.
a lot of people to those pages and
Yeah.
our customers and future customers, all kinds of stuff.
Totally.
That just past spring.
So never make a backup a part of the primary system you're designed to protect. Always have some amount of separation between the two. Because if one goes down, at least you have the other one that's okay to pick up the slack. That's the separation part. The interdependency part is it doesn't really help you. Let's say you decide to install a backup generator on your house to make sure your electricity stays long in case the power grid goes down. If there's a failure in the generator that causes a spark that starts a fire that burns down your house, your fail-safe was very counterproductive. Right, so ensuring that there's some separation there, make sure that a failure in your backup system doesn't cascade to the primary system. And the lesson here is try to never have a single critical point of failure for any critical system that your business relies on. So if the system relies on a critical input or inputs to function, you should plan for what is going to happen if and when those critical inputs aren't there, and plan and invest accordingly. Many companies actually have a policy of more than a certain number of high-level employees of the company can't travel on the same plane, because if a single plane goes down, that's a single point of failure. And so it is more expensive for a company to charter 2 or 3 jets instead of just 1. But chartering 2 or 3 provides some critical redundancy just in case something bad happens.
Like that terrible hockey team in Russia.
Yes.
against Street Fighter.
Yes.
Fail-safe. Questions for reflection. Have you developed fail-safes you can rely on if critical systems fail? Are your backups reliable and accessible if you need them? Are your fail-safes independent from your primary systems, so failures don't cascade from one to the other?
Now, along this same line of thinking of planning for resilience, building in some flexibility so our business can survive unexpected things, there's a technique that's very useful here. It's called stress testing. And stress testing means identifying the boundaries of a system by simulating certain environmental conditions. So I like to think of stress testing as kind of going into demon mode. You're taking this beautiful system that you've built, flipping a switch in your mind and says, ha, 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 how do I break it? How do I break this thing that I have built? And you start looking for all the ways that you could just destroy the system. And stress testing is a great way to understand how your system works, because it's kind of using the opposite of the thinking that you have used to create the system. By trying to poke holes in it intentionally, you end up learning a lot about the primary system itself. Netflix, I was reading an article a little while ago, has a little program that runs on their servers. I think they call it something like Crazy Monkey or Demon Monkey, or it's something along those things. And the sole focus of this program, which Netflix engineers installed in their system internally, is to shut off random nodes of the system at unpredictable intervals. And it's running all the time. They literally programmed a demon monkey and they let it loose in their system on purpose. And the reason they did that is because Demon Monkey is running around causing havoc all over the place. They need to design their system to withstand a threat that is literally present in the system. They put it there. And as a result, their system is a lot more robust than it otherwise might be. So the idea with stress testing is if you try to break your system, you're going to learn a lot more about the system, and you're going to be able to design the system to withstand the bad things that are probably going to happen at some point in time.
Stress testing. Questions for reflection. How much do you know about the limits of the system's performance? What could you intentionally break or stress in order to test your capabilities?
Now, related to stress testing is an idea called scenario planning. And scenario planning means constructing hypothetical situations, then mentally simulating what you would do if they occurred. So think of scenario planning as a systematic method of doing counterfactual simulation for your business. So by coming up with as many courses of action for potential circumstances that you may come across, you'll develop several potential responses in advance that you can use to be prepared for if and when those things occur. So a lot of what constitutes what people usually call corporate strategy involves scenario planning. So imagining if something happens, assuming it's going to happen, coming up with a couple ways of responding to it, and then preparing the strategies that make the most sense, and keeping a history.
This is something similar that might happen again in a different way in the future, and this is a way that we can solve for that.
Yes, Crisis PR does the same thing. It's scenario planning. So this is one of those things, just like counterfactual planning, it's really easy to not make the time to do it because it feels like additional work and you've got a whole lot of other things to think about. Scenario planning, so doing this systematically for your business, falls into the same category. It's something you have to intentionally set aside time to do. But when you set aside time to do it, you're developing action plans that will be beneficial when something along these lines occur. Because you're essentially doing pre-analysis and pre-committing to certain decisions, which makes responding to certain events far easier when it actually happens. So it's also, on the other end, possible to take this too far. So no matter how much scenario planning you do, that does not constitute being able to predict the future. And there are some events that are so catastrophic or are so unknowable that you could spend all day, every day, trying to plan for these things, and you never think about it, and you won't be prepared anyway. So doing scenario planning for the zombie apocalypse, probably not a big business priority. So just focus on the most likely scenarios, the ones that are most likely to impact your business in a significant way. Develop the plans for those things first, and then you'll get most of the benefit of the approach for the minimum amount of invested time and energy.
Scenario planning. Questions for reflection. How much time do you spend asking and answering what would happen if questions? What are some potential scenarios that could affect your current project? Assume each of these scenarios actually occur. What would you do, and how could you prepare right now?
The next idea is an idea called the middle path. And it's something that we've talked about throughout this entire series, but we've never put a name on it until now. And the middle path is there's a balance between too little of something and too much. So the middle path is what makes business as much an art as it is a science. You need to find this middle point, the enough point between doing too much of something and doing too little of something. And the trick is nobody can really tell you in advance what that middle path is. It's a constant process of looking at what you're doing, trying to figure out if you're not doing enough, or if you're doing too much, or if what you're doing is just right for you now in this moment. So it's a learning process. And going back to the idea of uncertainty, uncertainty is a rule of life. It's a part of the game that we are playing. And so there's really no point in being afraid of the uncertainty. It's never going to go away. So you might as well get used to the process of looking out there into the world, trying to estimate just exactly what enough looks like, and making adjustments to make sure you get there and stay there.
The middle path. Questions for reflection. Are you looking for the middle path between too little and too much? What can you do to remind yourself that the best approach is often the middle road, not an extreme?
Now, the experimental mindset is, I would say, the healthiest approach to business. When it comes down to it, we all have ideas that we would love to have work. But there's no way to tell in advance with certainty, with 100% certainty, what will work and what won't. So the best thing that you can do is constantly experiment, constantly test, constantly learn and try new things, and make adjustments, and use what you learn in the process to go and test and experiment with something else. So every experiment that you run, every new thing that you try, every new thing that we'll test will give you more information that you can use to make the next experiment and the next test even better.
The experimental mindset. Questions for reflection. What experiment could you try for the next 3 to 30 days just to find out what happens? How would your life change if you thought of everything you do as a grand experiment?
So when it comes to creating a successful business, and also when it comes to living a happy, healthy, productive, fulfilling life, it really just all comes down to the experimentation. Watching the world around you, coming up with ideas to make it better, testing it, seeing what happens, and then doing it again. And if you can do that, it's not a question of if you will create a successful business or a healthy and satisfying and productive life. It's a question of when. And that's the process, just a lot of experimentation. So, if you're going to do it, might as well have fun with it. And the quote from Julia Child, the world-renowned chef, after flopping a potato pancake onto the floor during her TV show is, "The only way you learn to flip things is just to flip them." And truer words were never spoken. The end.
I hope you've enjoyed the fundamental business concepts presented in this program. For best results, take a moment to schedule time to review this program 6 months from today. I found that reviewing these concepts regularly helps me recall them in the moment and act accordingly. Every time I review these concepts, I generate even more new ideas to improve my business. I'm sure you'll experience the same. I'd love to hear about how you're using the ideas in this program. You can contact me directly via email. Send your letter to Josh, J-O-S-H, at personalmba.com. I read every message, and I'm looking forward to hearing about your success. For even more business training, you can visit the Personal MBA website at personalmba.com. Thanks for listening, and best wishes as you build your business.
Congratulations on completing this entire program. Believe me, that's an accomplishment to be proud of. And the ideas and strategies you've discovered are going to generate positive results immediately and for years to come. But do you know that you've also discovered something even more valuable? You've actually uncovered the secret to achieving greatness in every part of your life. The secret is this. When you listen to even a little bit of a personal development program each day, you can't help but dramatically improve your life. It's no coincidence or accident that the people who listen to Nightingale Conant programs almost every day are at the tops of their fields, or that they're more connected to their family and friends, earn significantly more, enjoy greater health, and are genuinely happier people. It happens because every day the greatest success ideas known to man are effortlessly planted in their minds, where they take root, grow, and become an automatic part of their thinking, attitude, and actions. In other words, these folks have literally programmed themselves to be, do, and have more in life. And they've done it just by listening to Nightingale Conant audio programs. You can do the same starting right now. Take a minute to log on to nightingale.com. While you're there, scan our vast audio library to find a program or segment that grabs your attention and addresses something that's happening in your life right now. Check out the newest releases by some of the greatest authors and experts of our time. Listen to hours of free, idea-rich audio. Watch a free, inspiring video, or take a free test that will give you the answers you've been searching for. The greatest ideas from the last 50 years are yours for the taking at nightingale.com. Log on now before life gets in the way. That's nightingale.com. Thank you for listening to this Nightingale Conant audio program.